Well, thanks everybody for joining today. I know we've had a couple of sessions over the last several weeks at the Days of Knowledge event in Birmingham and also Days of Knowledge Copenhagen, where Josh was, and then also last week at the Directions North America conference, where we talked briefly about some of the cool new things happening in Dynamics customer service and the way that you can tie in with some voice bots and doing some things with OpenAI and some of those cool things. But one of the big takeaways that we really felt like came out of those conferences was people want to know more about prompt engineering and how to actually make these tools work for you on a day-to-day basis. So I'll give you just kind of a quick introduction as to DCG and kind of set this up because I think this is really important for then I'll hand it off to Josh to really get into the meat of the webinar. But DCG, we're a traditional Microsoft consulting firm specializing in a lot of areas of Microsoft. Pretty much if Microsoft does it, we can help you with it. But one arm of DCG is our PowerLearn Academy. And our PowerLearn Academy, we help set up training centers of excellence as well as staffing resources for organizations that want to learn more about the Microsoft technology. So as an example, if your organization wants to know more about Microsoft technologies, including OpenAI and prompt engineering and some of the other tools that are out there, we can create a training plan very specific for your company. So feel free to reach out to myself, Josh, David, any members of our team after this webinar, so we can talk to you a little bit more about how we can do a lot more for your organization as it relates to training around artificial intelligence and all up Microsoft technology. So as I mentioned before, we've seen this demand happening around artificial intelligence, specifically large language models and prompts, and how do you actually get the results from those tools that you need. I mean, you've got tools out there now like ChatGPT and Bard and Claude and all the various models that go along with those tools. But those tools are only as good as the prompt and the training that you can give those models. And for those of us that are savvy enough to actually know how to get what we want out of those tools. So, I heard somebody say one time that, AI is not going to take our jobs, but smart people who know how to use AI and LLM tools very well could take your job. So we want to make sure that we are creating a workforce today that is upskilled in a way to know how to use these tools to make their day-to-day jobs more efficient and get the most out of those tools. So really that's where today's webinar, I'm going to hand it off to Josh to really talk about that here now. But today's webinar is all about like the real world. How do we build prompts? How do we build those different personas? How do we overall use these AI tools and large language models to put them to work inside of your organization and for your role? So Josh Santiago is he's got a new title now. He doesn't know it until just now, but I'm going to call him the prompt maestro because he's really good at kind of taking this symphony of many different tools and ways that you can do things and making it all sing and sound really, really good and look really good. So Prompt Maestro is going to be presenting to us today. Feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go along. I would love to interact more with the group throughout the webinar. So with that, Josh, I'll hand it off to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dustin. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I look forward to spending the next few minutes kind of sharing some of the techniques that I've learned over the last few months. And obviously now we're a little over 18 months into the Gen AI craze and everything that's come out. I remember the first prompt that I actually have a screenshot of the first prompt that I ever put into ChatGPT, which is help me understand how to use a new ADL, the new ADFS integration with Active Directory, or as it's now called Intra. And so I was reading through some different ways to integrate using a newer version of Intra. And so the first thing I ever did was Microsoft related. And then the second thing I did with it was I rewrote the ending to Breaking Bad, where Walt dies and Jesse takes over, and he's the new Walt, and it goes through several generations of his family, and then taking over half of Albuquerque and all of this. And so I realized the infinite power of generative AI in that moment was, hey, you can do fun things with it that are really creative that you wouldn't have been able to do before, like writing fan fiction, or you can do things as heavily intensive as coding and learning how to do new things that maybe are outside of your core skill set. So obviously, over the last few months, we've seen the rise of Microsoft Copilot, the integration of it into Windows, the integration of it into a number of different applications. And so with that, I kind of want to take you through this journey that we've been on all together. And so with that, let's kind of talk about how Gen AI works, first of all. Let's take a step back and get a brief understanding of how it works. So LLMs, or large language models, largely function off of a set of modalities, right? Most commonly, we're familiar with the modality of text, right? Writing prompts into it and getting responses. And over the last few months, we've seen things like DALL-E and Stable Diffusion, as well as Midjourney, take over the image side of things. And then OpenAI released Sora and Whisper, and now we're into voice and to text and video. And so don't just think of a language model as something that can just generate a paragraph of text. We're seeing integrations of language models and generative AI in a number of different applications, whether that's image or audio generation or video generation. I literally watched a video last night of somebody that had created a generative AI model that allows you to create new genres of music, which was very interesting to me. And it'll actually synthesize background music for you. And so I thought that was really interesting. So quick highlights, as Dustin said, right? Nobody is taking your job actively, but we are going to see a big shift in how we work over the next few years. And yes, it will kill jobs, but if you are ahead of it and if you learn some of these skill sets, you're going to be very adept at being able to navigate the change to the workforce, right? Professional services, the world I live in and have lived in for the last 15 years, right? Bain & Company said that 41% of my labor time can be outsourced to generative AI. And me and George Brown were presenting together at Directions last week. That costs about 12 cents a day. So if you don't think it's going to be disruptive to the labor market, think again, because we've all heard of outsourcing for years, right, to other countries where labor rates are much lower. You can't get any lower than 12 cents a day. So think about the sheer impact it's going to have, but also think about it from the perspective of how much more can I accomplish, or how much more polished can my work be by leveraging generative AI. And whether you're in leisure and restaurants or whether you're in professional services, you can see a broad swath of everything could be heavily automated using generative AI. And obviously on the lower end of that scale, those in manufacturing and supply chain, those things haven't come as far as of yet. But this was back in May of 2023. I was just at Directions last week. We had conversation about lights off, self-healing, supply chain systems, automatic continuous close financial systems, all kinds of things that are on this lower end of the spectrum that we're now seeing come up substantially. So as we progress in this world of generative AI, we're going to see a big shift in how the labor market works. So how do language models work? So you're going to start with a prompt. That's basically where everything resides, is it's going to start in how you interact with the system. And that interaction is a prompt. That's the input text. And then the system is going to take that and it's going to do what's called pre-processing. And pre-processing is just a big fancy word for it breaks it down into its component structure. And those component structures are tokens. And those tokens relate to various topics across a vector database. And that vector database, and I wish I would have put the slide in here, but a vector database is a 3D representation of a number of grouped together tasks or words or themes or topics or classifications. So the best slide I saw on this was about Star Wars, and it had obviously, you could see that the the good guys were on one side and they're all represented in this nebulous inside of the vector model where they're all grouped together. And then you can see, you know, Darth Vader and Darth Maul and all the bad guys are grouped together in their own area. Well, that's the same way that vector databases allow language models to understand what the next series of words in a sequence are, right? They live inside of this vector model. And so if I talk about, you know, a Porsche, well, it knows that I'm in the realm of German automotive vehicles, right? Well, there's a number of subtasks and subclassifications that all relate to that. So if my question is, you know, which Porsche is better than which Mercedes, it now knows I'm living in the world of automotive and I'm inside of two specific manufacturers and I'm asking it to classify what's the best, right? So you can see how a vector database allows you to not go, okay, there's a comparison row and a comparison column for this, and we're going to go to that row and that column and return that result. So on the technical side, it's not like a SQL database, but what it is like is it is like a data cube. So if you're familiar with data cubes, I know Dustin's laughing in the background because we just had this argument last week that these things have been around a lot longer than we think they have. But once you go through that process, once it's done the embedding model and it's taken everything through the vector database, it then goes in and it retrieves that information and then it spits it out into text generation and it gives you that answer. And one thing that's also in here is called RAG. RAG is retrieval augmented generation. So if I add a PDF that is, and I'll demo this in a few minutes, but if I add a PDF that say our company's policies and I ask it a question like, what's our PTO policy? Well, the language model hasn't been trained on DCG's PTO policy. It's been trained on what a PTO policy is, how they're structured, what they look like typically, what the standard PTO policies are. So it's going to return that. What RAG does is it allows the model to not necessarily be fine-tuned, but it allows the model to retrieve information that is user-specific or task-specific and actually supplement that into its response. This has become really, really popular because language models are great for, you know, write me a joke about ice, right? Something like that. And it's the one that I did the other day. But what they're not good at is I need DCG specific information. Now, unless you've built a model that's specifically designed for your company and for that, it's not going to give you that information. So that's one thing to think about when you're writing a prompt is if it's really specific to your organization, it's not going to have that information unless you give it that information. And a lot of these tools out there, Copilot and Claude, Bing, ChatGPT, Gemini, all of them have the modality now to be able to insert RAG data into it. And so we'll look at that, but just be aware of that. So how do they use tokens, right? What is a token? Everybody talks about tokenization. They talk about how tokens function, but what actually is a token, right? So a token is roughly 4 characters. It can either be 3/4 of a word or it can be a function of certain characters. Roughly 100 tokens is about 75 words. So you can think about it that way. And then what they do is they break those tokens down into their subsequent IDs, and those IDs are what's fed to the vector database. So the vector database is a series of numerical functions. This is how the LLM converts the text back to the vector database model so that it can then process and share the information with you. And so how do we get prompts into a usable format? So this is about an 8,000 token prompt that I put in there. And you can see that ChatGPT is currently processing through it, right? I asked it to create a very specific market research analysis of a market entry for a Dynamics 365 partner for Business Central as a subscription model in the construction industry, right? Really hyper specific what I wanted. And I gave it the details of how I wanted it to actually build this out. So you can see it's writing the executive summary. It's giving me the introduction. It's writing the market overview. And this is going out and it's leveraging Bing to do the searching and find the data. You can see it's cited the information there. So we know that hallucinations are going to be low in this particular prompt because I've told it I wanted to go out and search for this information. I told it I wanted to build in a SWOT. And so it's giving me what I've asked for. If you're struggling with getting good information out of your prompts, I would say spend more time writing the prompt than you do copying and pasting it or reviewing it, right? Because that's going to give you a much cleaner output. And we'll go through how we get that in just a minute. I'm going to share this slide, move on. This is how Copilot integrates with your Microsoft system to provide a much deeper response than any other language model that exists out there. ChatGPT is really good at what it does, but what's different is Microsoft has baked in the Microsoft Graph into the processing and grounding data. It's also integrated the Office 365 apps. And why that's so important is things like Dynamics 365 CRM and ERP systems are now integrated into Dataverse, which live in the Microsoft Graph, which means I can ask a question like, what's the 3 largest accounts that I sold in the last 6 months? And what are their expected volume of sales in the next 12 months? And the system, because it can access Microsoft Graph, can do a level of RAG that no other application can. This isn't a pitch for going out and buying Copilot, but it is just an example of how these systems are being deeper integrated into the technology that we use today, so that when we do ask it for things, because if I ask ChatGPT the same question, it would just return, I don't know who your top customers are. But by leveraging tools that are integrated into your system that have access to graph data, you can get much deeper responses. So what do we have out there? What exists today, right? So there's ChatGPT. Most of us have used that one. There's also Claude by Anthropic, which is ChatGPT is powered by Microsoft Azure. Microsoft's given them $10 billion of funding to do that. Claude is built off of Amazon Bedrock, off the AWS platform, and is funded by Amazon. So those are the 2 big players. Obviously, Bing Chat is just a more consumer-friendly version, and it's integrated into Bing. It's accessible to pretty much everyone out there, and it uses OpenAI. So there's no difference between ChatGPT 4 and Bing Chat, with the exclusion of there's a little bit more of Microsoft's modeling on top of it, so the responses aren't always the same. And then Bard, the slide's a little bit old. Bard's been renamed to Gemini. This is Google's platform. It sits off of the GCP platform, Google's cloud platform. It's based off of Lambda and Palm models. So it's a very different type of language model compared to things like Claude and ChatGPT. They're based off of different models. One's based off of RLHF, and the other's based off of the Llama series. So how do we develop good prompts? So now I'm kind of taking you through how language models work. I'm going to spend the last 30 minutes of this really diving into what we need to do to maximize what we get out of the system. So there's 6 kind of key elements that I want you to take away from this as to how you use the system, right? Clarity, 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 clarity. I want you to stop before you ever start typing anything into the system. I want you to think, what do I want to get out of the system? What is this supposed to look like? And that's where clarity and specificity come into this, really key, because the more clarity you can give the machine learning model and the more specificity you can give it, the more accurate of a response you're going to get. If you give it something like, what is sustainability? You're going to get this long, drawn out definition about what sustainability is. If you tell it, I need a very specific sustainability report, and we'll go through this in a minute, you'll see how as we give it more clarity and specificity, the corresponding result will be much better. And so if you're struggling with, I don't really see a value in using ChatGPT, or I'm not getting anything good out of it, or it's repetitive, or it doesn't make any sense, or it doesn't fit with the context of what I do, that's one of those things. It's like, well, you've got to give it a lot more context, because the language model has no clue what you're asking it for. This is what was funny. I was helping my wife with some things not too long ago, and she's just getting into ChatGPT, and she was like, this output isn't anything related to what I do. And I was like, well, the prompt you gave it was write this or write something very generic. And I was like, try refining that prompt down and see if it doesn't give you something more accurate. And so after several iterations later, it became much more aligned with what she was looking for. So again, that's where iterative refinement is really important to this too. Don't just give up if ChatGPT gives you something that's wildly off base, right? Look at what it gave you and say, okay, well, that's wrong because I know this, and this is wrong because it's not thinking about this. And then tell it that, hey, you didn't consider this context, or you didn't consider this information. Consider that and rebuild this response, right? And then you'll see a much more iterative refinement where it gets closer and closer to your output. Instructions, explicit instructions are very important because language models do much better with positive prompting than negative prompting. So what I mean by that is don't just say, don't do this, or don't provide me with a list, provide me with a table. Rather, give it a positive design where you say, provide me with 3 examples, provide a table format, make this in a creative narrative, right? Don't give exclusionary terms. Language models don't really comprehend that as well. It's getting better, but it's one of those things you'd have a much better time giving clear positive instructions than negative instructions. So how do we structure a prompt? So let's look at this example of prompt structuring. We start with a persona. Personas are a great way to tailor the language model to an area or a genre or a business type that will allow us to get it in the mindset of what we live in, right? I spend a lot of time telling it it's a Microsoft consultant, or it's a management consultant, or it's a strategy consultant, because then that tailors it down to the language model goes, okay, this is the area in the vector database that I need to be thinking of. Strategy and alignment and implementation in the Microsoft world. That's kind of helping it tailor where it's responding from inside of the nebulous of the trillions of parameters that it's been taught on. So right here, we can see we've given this persona of a seasoned investment analyst with a knack for predicting market trends, right? So I want it to act like Warren Buffett. You can go so far as just to say that. I want you to act like Warren Buffett. Sometimes giving it a persona doesn't mean giving it a generic title or job role. Sometimes if you're doing something creative and you want it to take on a persona, you can actually tell it to take on a certain person. If they have a wealth of writing or a wealth of materials that the model's been trained on, like for example, I love asking it to write Google reviews in the persona of Anthony Bourdain or Gordon Ramsay or other famous chefs that have large bodies of work, because it takes on a very funny persona. If you ask it to write in the style of Anthony Bourdain, it's going to be very harsh and abrasive and funny and have that kind of witty humor to it. If I ask it to write in the style of Ernest Hemingway, it's going to be long and eloquent and poetic and verbose and all of these things. And it's gonna be very creative in how it writes. So think about, again, from the output perspective, what do I want the tone and how do I want it to read? And if you're thinking about that, then you can help design the prompt around that. And then you want to immediately follow it up by giving it a task. So it's an investment persona, and I want you to give me a detailed investment report. Well, what's a detailed investment report? Well, outline the reasons for selecting a particular tech stock, highlighting factors that make it a promising investment opportunity, right? I've given it the task and the context. These are the big parts that we don't spend enough time on. Spend more time here. And the other thing too is giving it examples. The more examples of what you're looking for, or if you can give it a framework, or if you can give it an existing document of how it's already written, you shortcut a lot of iteration off of what it takes to build these. Because then the system knows, oh, this is what it's supposed to look like. These are the things that you're looking for. If not, it's just going to go, I think this is what it should look like because this is what I've seen in my training data, and this is what I've kind of seen how it responds or how the language is used. So I'm just going to do it this way. But if you give it examples, and this is a very light example of some of the stuff that I'm doing now, where I'm actually feeding it documents and saying, model it like this document and respond accordingly. So as the systems advance, we'll see a lot more of this. And then finally, we want to set the format. So structure the report with clear sections like an introduction, a company overview, financial analysis, and market trends, right? Those are key sections I want it to write. And if I don't give it that format, it may write an introduction, it may write an overview, it may not do the financial analysis, and it may not do market trends. It's going to pick and choose what it does based off of what it's seen in other data. So by giving it a clear format of how to respond, gives you a much more cleaner response. And then the tone is important, right? Do you want it to be investment grade? Do you want it to be written like a Forbes article? Do you want it to be very professional and confident? Or do you need it to be relaxed and easily understandable by people that are maybe not investment professionals, right? There's a report that's good for people that are in investment banking, right? It's going to talk about, net present value and what the last 7 quarters CAGR looked like. But if you're writing this to, your grandmother who's maybe a little investment savvy, but it's not what she does every day, the tone needs to be different. So think about your audience of who's going to be consuming the content as well to really get a good understanding of how the tone needs to be written from the language model's perspective. I want to pause there because I can't see the team screen with how my system's set up. So I want to see if there's any questions that I need to respond to. Dustin, is there?
Josh, I don't see any questions right now, but just a reminder to everyone that if you do have questions, feel free to drop those in the chat or in the Q&A, and we can address those as we go along.
Perfect. So I want you to think about how you control the output a little bit more. So we talked about the ability to get creative, like creative writing styles, poetry, stories, scenarios. These are great from a business perspective because sometimes I want a narrative. Sometimes I want a creative rendition of what I'm doing. Sometimes I need a case study that's in the form of something that's interesting to read. And so creative writing is something. Factual text, right? You can ask it to provide factual outlines. What I really like is if you don't know a subject and you want to get up to speed very quickly, Q&A can be really important for, for example, I'm a consultant that I don't spend a lot of time in the supply chain side of things. So whenever I jump over to the supply chain side, now granted, I have an amazing counterpart, Will, who's been in it for years, who is really skilled at it. I'm not. So there's times I'm like, ChatGPT, help me get up to speed on this really quickly. What's this process and what's cross-docking and what does this mean? And when we're in 3PL and we're doing this, what do these terms mean? And so when I get on a phone call, I have a much deeper understanding of what some of the client issues are. So don't forsake the Q&A function of chat as a way to learn things. You can ask it multi-part questions. You can ask it to dive into hypothetical scenarios. This is a great way to learn and to develop a new skill set too. List generation. List generation is really good. I need you to generate a list of the top 5 topics from this transcript, right? Again, thinking about how you feed data into it. You can do conversational styles where you're going back and forth with it. And actually, the best model I've seen for this is actually Claude. And there's a lot of times where Claude and I will have a full-on conversation back and forth about something. And it is like conversing with a person. ChatGPT is a little bit more stoic, but I find that Claude is actually really good at going, did you actually consider this? Or have you thought about this? And I'm like, oh, you know what? I haven't considered this. Let's dive into this. Can you explain how these interrelate or how these cross-synthesize into the topic that we're talking about? So some models are better than others at different tasks. So some principles that you should consider, right? Clarity, describe the function, right? Specificity, list the top 5. Concision, summarize. I find that summaries work really well, especially when you need to get a lot of detail like transcripts and meeting notes down into simple bullet points. Instructiveness, right? Writing a business problem matrix. That's a really complex document to write if you've never written a problem matrix. Chat does a fantastic job of doing one of those in a couple of seconds based off some pain points and some other data. Iterative refinement, again, you want to refine, because you can see the first prompt is rather generic. Summarize the email into some details, and then go a step further. Refine it down. Give me the next action items. So I'm going to skip over this intermediate level prompt really quick, and I'm going to dive into what a more detailed structure looks like. So if we look at the evolution of prompt refinement, right? This is the journey that most people will take, right? They're going to Google something first, right? This is what I call Googling it. Just give me a topic on sustainability or write something about sustainability. And then it just gives a pretty broad outline of it. And then the next one is we say, write a brief on sustainability. Well, a brief is a specific document with certain structures to it. So now we're structuring how the response is looking. And we want to revise it again because we're actually looking about the impact of sustainability on our business, right? Global food production. And then we say, okay, well, we need to take that a step further and we need to focus on potential solutions and adaptations for clients, right? From a consulting perspective. So then that allows us to model it a little bit differently, and we can see we get more action-oriented tones, we get more solution orientation, and then finally, when we get to the bottom where we're really thinking about some of these things, we say, okay, I want you to take on the persona of a leading sustainability and ESG consultant, write a brief. So again, that same document structure for a mid-market food manufacturing CEO. So now we have our target audience on the impact of sustainability, right? So not just give me some action-oriented goal solutions, but I want you to talk about impact on two specific areas: food production and sustainability or profitability, and then create solutions and adaptive measures around that to then extend sustainability across an entire organization with the underlying goal of improving profitability. So this is a fairly complex undertaking when you think about it from a pure strategy standpoint and from a pure documentation standpoint, right? There's 5 or 6 different moving components in that need to be researched and understood and vetted, and so the system is able to do all of that in a matter of seconds, where it would take us several hours to do that. So this is one of the ways that you can truly leverage that. So again, refining is a constant process. Just like in consulting, we want to identify the problems with our prompt once we've written it. We want to make sure that we adjust the prompt so that it has more specificity, more context, more instruction tokens. And then we want to test that prompt. We want to see, is it getting what we want out of it? And then once we've done that, then we want to do iterative refinement further to get the exact prompt out of it. And finally, I highly recommend keep a OneNote, a Notion, whatever tool you use. If you write it down on your desk, I don't care, but make notes about how you've refined your prompts, because eventually you'll come across the same scenario, or you need to come back later and go, how did I do that? How did I write that? Because I like the output of that. But if you don't remember it, or maybe if you're using Bing Chat or another tool that doesn't have threads, several tools out there still don't have threaded messaging where you can go back and review your previous messages, Copilot being the worst offender in that. You're going to need to write it down because you may not be able to go back and just find the prompt. So be aware of that. So I'm going to switch gears right now. We're going to go into kind of a live view of what this looks like. So I'm going to show off some models. That way you can see all of the current landscape that's out there and how they function and kind of what's available to everybody. And so if you give me just a second. And then I'm going to show you a way to do prompt engineering that is kind of new. It's not really something that I think a lot of people have talked about as of yet. But it is something that allows you to kind of shortcut the whole process of what I just talked about. So let's go into the models. Just grab this and share it out here. All right. So for those of you who have not had a chance yet, chat.openai.com is ChatGPT. It's how you're able to access that model. And you can see that you're going to be presented pretty much on all of these with the same basic functions, right? It's a chat window where you can enter a message, you can upload files, which is how we do RAG data, right? Same thing with Claude, same thing with Gemini, same thing with Grok, same thing with AI Studio, same thing with Perplexity, same thing with Hugging Chat. So let's go through each one of these individually and kind of look at how they function. So this is Claude. I'm signed into it. You can see my threaded messages right there, kind of where we've gone from the conversations that we've been having internally, which is really nice because with Claude, unlike all the other ones, once you start a message in it, it'll actually search through all of your previous chats, and it will help you to find previous chats that you've already used, or you can use some of the pre-built ones that they have here. Gemini is Google's, so it's gemini.google.com. And you can see most of them usually give you kind of some sample prompts to use. Then there's usually a disclosure. You can dismiss the disclosure. But again, you can see all of these are the same chat window style tool. So just be aware of that. There's not a lot of complexity to how you use them. They are pretty straightforward. Grok is a new one that allows you to actually pick different models. So these are all open source models, whether they're Llama 2 and 3. You can see context windows, Mixtral, Gemma. There's a number of different models that you can actually select. What's different about Grok is all about speed, as where some of these other ones are about accuracy. So if I just click this, you're going to notice I'm pushing roughly 900 tokens a second. And when we run some of these other ones, we're going to notice that we're not going to do nearly the same speed as Grok. So if you need a quick response or you want to generate something, just be aware that you're able to use Grok to do that. Now, the benefit is you can select different models, and some of these models have better accuracy for certain tasks, which is why it's beneficial to kind of understand that. Now, here's something that I thought was really interesting, because I wanted to show you this, because this is still in preview. It's not actually available. You have to go sign up for it. You need a developer account and several other things. So we're inside of AI Studio, which is a little bit different from the public commercial version of Gemini, but this actually allows me to use Gemini 1.5 Pro. And the difference there is most language models have a context window between 40,000 to 128,000 in Claude to it's a couple 100,000 tokens, right? Between 50 and a couple 100,000 tokens. Gemini Pro 1.5 has a 1 million token context window. So what I've done is I've loaded several Microsoft documents into RAG. So I've given it the Modern Workplace Comparison Guide that has pricing on it. I've given it the Sales Leaders Definitive Guide to Microsoft. I've given it the Copilot deck from last week, and I've given it the Microsoft AI transformation playbook. So in all total, I have 42,000 tokens of context in this one prompt. Now, what's beneficial is I just asked it a simple question: which Copilot plan is I misspelled best, but which is the best for someone with a Microsoft 365 E3 license? And so we can see here, it talks about its knowledge cutoff date, and then it starts reviewing through the documentation. But you can see here, it's actually pulled in that RAG data. And so it talks about what's available in the E3 license. It actually gives you reference to how the Copilot and M365 licenses play together. So it tells you, hey, look, I've got a knowledge cutoff, but here's what your own data told me. And so this is where having large context windows are really useful, because I can keep going. Explain the, let's just see here, explain the partner. If I can spell opportunities correctly, that would help. You can never type when somebody's watching. I've found that, and I forgot the last word. But anyway, I can just give it that, and then it's going to work through all of the context that I've already given it to find these partner opportunities and share them. So we can see here that it's actually working through all of the information. So obviously there's a new AI and Copilot advisory service that Microsoft is trying to pitch to partners, right? There's the readiness assessments in there that we can talk about. There's the deployment procedures. And you can see here that none of this actually lives inside of the knowledge cutoff for what Gemini already knows. So it's using the RAG context to be able to provide me with more details. This is what's so beneficial in each of these platforms, whether it's ChatGPT or Claude. Gemini at the current time only supports image modality, so you can upload an image, so just be aware of that. Some of these other ones like Grok do not support file transfer as of yet, but you can see here how beneficial these models are in being able to provide information. And so here's a really simple prompt that has deployed a lot of information based off of RAG. So another thing to think about here is your prompt context can be much smaller when you have a lot of RAG data. Without a lot of RAG data, you're searching a trillion parameter model, and you need to get very specific. So think about it that way. This is what Perplexity's model looks like. See the basic prompt that I was working on for an interview guide. So Perplexity is, I believe it's running Meta's models, so Facebook's models. But this is another tool that you can use. And then this is a brand new one that I want to bring to everybody's attention. So if you haven't heard of Hugging Face yet, you got to check out Hugging Face. It is the entire repository for all things AI. So it's where all the models live. It's where all the details live. So if I just open the model page here in Hugging Face, I can actually look at, it is the GitHub repository for everything AI. So this is kind of what's really cool about Hugging Face is there's different models in there that you can access. There's data sets that you have access to training, right? So if you want to do, if you want to fine tune a model on image segmentation, you're able to do that. So, but they've just released their own chatbot, which is really interesting because now you have access to the models that are inside of Hugging Face, which is nice because now you're not bound by a specific model. So if I wanted to test drive Microsoft's brand new, just released today, if I wanted to test out Microsoft's Pi 3 small language model, I can activate the model and then I can come over here and I can chat with it. I can actually see what I'm doing using their model. So I can enable web search if I want to, but what is a GPT, right? So you can see here that now I'm using Microsoft's language model. So again, one of the things you want to be aware of is each language model is tailored to a very specific use case. Finding what language model works for you is kind of an important component. So now let's talk about prompt engineering refinement. One of the things that I want to talk about is this new model where we go into having the machine learning model actually become your prompt engineer for you. So as where we just spent the last 30, 40 minutes talking about how we prompt engineer ourselves, if you're stuck, what you can actually do is you can actually prompt the language model using a prompt like this to build out a prompt structure that is more detailed. So I'm going to say the GPT-4 model. So this is the pre-prompt that I just built, right? So I want you to act as an OpenAI prompt engineer, right? You have specific knowledge around the GPT-4 model. So I'm telling it where it's at and what it's doing. I want you to optimize a prompt to build the most detailed, focused on accuracy, maximize the response. And then I'm going to give it the prompt. And I'm actually going to give it the same prompt that I gave it earlier today. If I can go back to that one, actually, that's in a different window. Okay, here it is. Yeah. So, okay. So here's the first prompt that I gave it. Let me just come back over here so it's a little bit more simplified. Let's just look at this together. So I basically said, hey, I'm meeting with a client. I'm conducting a case interview. It's on a GP to Business Central migration. I'm meeting with their name. They're an AP specialist. So I've given them the name because it's important because sometimes it just gets lost in the sauce and it makes up somebody. So I gave it the name, I gave them the job role, and then I need to conduct a thorough interview to understand her role, how it's impacted by the system, what we need to develop, integrating to build out to make her life easier. I also need to conduct a DLO, a day in the life of, to understand what she's doing, how long it takes, how to achieve this. So it's a pretty well-structured prompt to begin with. But let's just take a look at this from the first initial pass. So if we load this prompt into the system, it's going to do what we asked, right? It's going to create some background questions. It's going to create, how do you currently use the system? If you notice, though, at least from my experience, it's good, but it's okay. There's some good detail there, but it's kind of trying to limit the response based off of the token limit. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to bypass that by getting a little bit more structure and a little bit more detail. So you can see here, it's filling out all of the things roughly I need to talk about, but I actually need it to be a bit more detailed and a bit more specific than this. So here's where I'm going to come back and I'm going to actually feed it that same prompt and I'm going to ask it to re-engineer it. So if you find yourself struggling to maybe engineer a good prompt, or you're like, how can I make this better? You can actually ask it to re-engineer the prompt to be better. So I'm going to now give it this more detailed prompt optimization script. And one of the things that the system knows is it knows it's a machine learning model. And so it's structuring it in a way that the machine learning model is going to be most effective. So if you notice how, as before, I've given it the objective, but I didn't state that it was the objective. I used the acronyms, but didn't necessarily call out what they were specifically. I just said GP to Business Central. So again, it's optimizing it in little ways that help the model understand where to go better. So now that we have this, let's take this prompt and feed it back to the system. And yeah, it's going to break the formatting. But now we can see here that it's providing us a little bit more detail. And this is what I mean by the amount of tokens per second. You can see here how it's still processing. So as ChatGPT grows and expands its user base, it requires more and more compute data. So just be aware of that. Sometimes it will slow itself down naturally. So we can see here that it's dealing with integrations, dealing with functionalities. But I want to show you something that's very interesting. Is I fed this same thing to Claude, changed the name, right? It's an Anthropic prompt engineer, not OpenAI. It's trained on this model that it's using, right? And then I gave it the outline and it gave me the prompt back. And then it gave me some really detailed questions. So you can see here, this is where certain language models actually perform better, right? Like what tasks consume the majority of your time when it deals with vendor setup and entry and payment invoices, and what systems do you integrate with, and what are those pain points? What challenges are you facing, right? These are all questions that I need to uncover. And then it actually gives me a DLO template. This is something that we noticed ChatGPT did not provide. It gave us kind of a DLO for how to ask questions about routine tasks, but this actually gives me a template to walk through. Okay, what tool are you using? What time of day is it? What are you working out of? What are you doing? So this gives me a much better structure, right? Same thing with, and oh, this is a good example because I'll just go back to this thread. Some models don't actually work. So I gave the same prompt engineering prompt over to ChatGPT or to Gemini, and Gemini just started building a more optimized response guide. So rather than giving me a new prompt, it went ahead, self-optimized, and then provided the response. So there's some benefit to that. There's some where it's more of a frustration than anything else because it didn't give you what you actually asked for. So just be aware of that. And so you can see here that I was able to get a little bit more detail out of Claude than I was able to get out of ChatGPT. So these are some of the ways that you can use prompt engineering to get more defined responses. And if, for example, you want to drill into something, I need you to expand the impact. So now I can further expand. So that's what I mean by being iterative, right? I'm like, oh, you know what? This is okay. But I actually want more than just 3 bullet points on current workflow. So I can actually ask it to then further refine this out. And one of the things that you'll notice with ChatGPT in particular is it does try to do token optimization, which you'll see commonly referred to as laziness. When they say, oh, the system's just being lazy, it's not. What it's doing is optimizing its token response because of obviously every single time you chat with it, it requires a tremendous amount of compute power on the back end, right? And so it's trying to optimize the system as much as possible, which is why results can look redundant. But there's other things you can do to fix that. So for example, one of the things that I like to point out that you can do, I need to go over to my settings, so I need my sidebar back, is you can actually go into your settings and you have the ability to do what's called data controls. Well, they've moved them, sorry. They're called custom GPT. Okay, so you can customize ChatGPT. And so what you can do here is like, for example, when I'm building marketing content, right? I'm telling it I want it to act as a product specialist. So this is what's called pre-priming a prompt. And in pre-priming of a prompt, you're actually feeding it pre-context into the instruction window of how it responds. So I'm actually telling it, I want it to respond with search engine optimization and SERP results as its primary function. And so you can see here, I've given it custom instructions, and then I can give it tone context outside of it. So if I were to save this and turn this back on, and then just start by giving it the same prompt that I did before, this optimized prompt. Now I want you to notice how differently it responds. It's going to respond as if we are building marketing content. So if you notice, there's a lot more keyword integration there, right? There's a lot more optimization about the structure and how it lays out the document. So by adding the custom instructions to the system, you're able to get a much better job of getting it to do and respond the way you want to. So obviously there's a ton to this. This is just a couple examples of how I use prompt engineering and some of the ways that you can use prompt engineering to leverage the system to get it to respond the way you want it to. But that's really kind of where I want to end things today. I know we've got a couple of minutes, so I want to stop in enough time that if we have questions, I can answer those. So Dustin, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thanks, Josh. This has been really helpful. I know for a lot of people just starting to get involved with tools like ChatGPT, there's a lot to these tools, but it takes skill and it takes kind of refinement, as Josh mentioned, to really try to get what you want out of it. So with that, I don't see any questions that we have right now in the chat. Certainly, if you have some of those, feel free to post that in here for Josh or myself now, and we'll be happy to take on any questions that you may have. But one follow-up that I know that we're going to be doing after this presentation or this webinar is really starting to work with our partners and clients to create training strategies for their company on how to best use these tools. Because us in the consulting industry, our use of tools like ChatGPT are going to be very different from someone in the manufacturing industry and how they would use large language models or AI tools in general. So I think, it's important that your company first starts with a strategy for how you want to use these, what efficiencies you want to gain, what job roles you believe are the key jobs to be able to start utilizing these tools. And we can help you with that. So we can create a training strategy for your organization and then start to execute on some of that. A lot of times we'll do like a 1-year upskilling program for organizations where monthly we have recurring trainings based on different topics that we feel like that the team needs. We can come in and we can do an assessment of your current employee skill levels. We can do some of those things up front to then create and craft a custom training plan for your organization. So if that's something that's of interest to you, please feel free to reach out to myself, Josh, or David after the webinar, and we'd be happy to get you in contact with somebody that can help envision that for you and help you envision what that could look like for your organization.